Hello everyone to this lab video where we're looking at an anatomical model of the kidney. So the model that you see in front of you is the anterior view of the kidney itself, where it has been cut across showing the transverse section. And this model in this case is just going to highlight some of the growth structures that are found within the kidneys. We'll show you in more detail about some of the internal structures that are found within the kidneys a little later on in the video. So let's first go through some of the major structures that are found within and around the kidneys. We'll start with the kidneys themselves. In this case, you can see the fact that the kidney has these individual layers, where on the outside you have this thick brown layer. This is called the renal capsule. It's a nice fibrous covering of the kidneys themselves, like a skin. Right on top of the kidneys themselves, we have a major gland. This is called the adrenal gland. This is also showing the transverse section, highlighting the adrenal cortex on the outside, and on the inside you have the adrenal medulla. In the endocrine system class, we're going to learn about how these individual components of the adrenal glands are responsible for the production of hormones, these chemical messengers that can change the overall physiology within the body. Coming back to the kidney themselves, as I mentioned, the outer skin is called the renal capsule. When you look farther in, you can divide the kidney essentially into two major regions. You have the outer portion of the kidney. This is called the renal cortex. This is the outer layer of the kidney, if you will. And then you have the internal portion of the kidney themselves. This is called the renal medulla. Now, before we look into the internal structures in a little more detail, let's talk about these vessels and these tubes that are going in and out of the kidneys. This is the part of the kidney called the hilum. This is where you have the entrance and exit of arteries, veins, and the renal pelvis leading into the ureter. So in red, we have the renal artery. This is what's bringing blood into the kidney for filtration. Then it's going to go through the filtration process and then creating urine. And then the blood exits out the kidney through the renal vein. And the other tube, that structure that you see here sort of in a cream beigey color, this is part of the structure that is going to be responsible for collecting urine from the individual renal pyramids that you see here. So these are rich in nephrons that are doing the filtering of the blood to create urine. All gets collected within the renal pelvis and then heads down the ureter into the urinary bladder for storage. So each one of our kidneys, in this case, symmetrically reflects the structure. You're looking at one kidney here. The other kidney will also have a similar structure where they're going to be going through the urine formation. So why don't we now focus on these internal structures using another model? So let me bring that out. This guy right here, and we'll talk about some of these individual structures themselves. So let's start with the process of how filtration begins, where blood is now entering into the kidney through the renal arteries. The renal arteries will then slowly start to branch into smaller and smaller blood vessels. So let's go through that branching hierarchy. The renal artery first separates into what's called the segmental artery. These will then split up into what's called the interlobar arteries. And now you're heading towards the renal cortex, where they're going to slowly start to spread themselves out through what's called the arcuate arteries. And then they form even smaller branches as they're heading towards those nephron structures, towards the glomerulus, where now you're referring to them as the cortical radii arteries. There you go, a little bit of a mouthful there. Once you're then heading out, you are then getting into these smaller structures where you see these little bulbs that you see here. This is the glomerulus. So the blood is going to enter into the glomerulus through what are called the afferent arterioles, enter into the glomerulus, and then it's going to exit out through the efferent arterioles, where they're going to then return their journey all the way back to the renal vein and then out of the kidneys themselves. Now, coming back to the glomerulus, this is connected directly with this green structure that you see here. This is part of the nephron. This is the basic functional unit where the urinary filtration process is going to take place. So connected with the glomerulus structure, where you have the blood rich structure here, you will have what's called the Bowman's capsule. This is the starting structure of the nephron themselves. This is where the filtration stage of urine formation begins, where all the fluid, or mostly the plasma in this case, is going to exit out just from the high hydrostatic pressure, entering into the Bowman's capsule. This is going to be free of any cells though, because the cells are just too big to enter through here, as well as any large proteins. So anything that is fluid in nature and dissolved in the fluid is going to enter into the nephron, into that Bowman's capsule that surrounds the glomerulus. These two structures together, in this case, is what we refer to as the renal corpuscle. You have the glomerulus and the Bowman's capsule. We refer to that as the renal corpuscle. So as the urine formation begins here, the first stage, which is called filtration, it is now going to enter within the nephron, where we now refer to it as filtrate. Here, you will then go through sort of a fine tuning of the urine through the remaining two stages, what's called reabsorption and secretion, where it's going to go through the remaining structures of the nephron. So let's highlight those guys. From the Bowman's capsule, we have the proximal convoluted tubule. This will then lead into the descending loop of Henle, go around and then come up the ascending loop of Henle, and then enter into the distal convoluted tubules, and then we have the collecting ducts going farther and farther deeper into the kidneys. So this is where you have other nephrons, as you can see, these other distal convoluted tubules connecting up with the collecting ducts of the various nephrons. And again, we have many nephrons that are found within the individual kidneys. So the urine filtrate is going to go through the nephron structure, completing the other two stages of urine formation, which is reabsorption. So essential nutrients and things are going to be returned back into the body. And then last stage is secretion, where any other fine-tuning things that needs to be removed from the body, we can then relieve it into the urine filtrate, and that can then get filtered out of our body. So let's now follow the track or the pathway for urine formation going through the various kidney structures. This pink structure that you see here is referred to as the renal pyramid. This is where you primarily find the loop of Henle. This is where it has a high salt concentration to allow for the very specific movement of fluid, whether you're looking at the descending portion or the ascending portion of the loop of Henle. This is also where we find the collecting ducts and part of the distal convoluted tubule. If you go to the bottom portion of the renal pyramid, so this pointy end here, this is where you're going to now enter into the minor calyx. So each one of these renal pyramids has a minor calyx connected to the renal pyramids themselves. The individual minor calyces, that's the plural for calyx, will then collect up into what's called the major calyx from the individual renal pyramids, and then all the major calyx is going to connect up to a common tube that's about to exit the kidney called the renal pelvis. From the renal pelvis, now the urine then exits out into the ureter, which is this tube right here, where it's going to go down the ureter into the urinary bladder for storage, where eventually the bladder will start to distend from increasing amounts of urine, eventually reaching a point where it just can't stretch anymore, and that's when we have the need to go relieve ourselves or urinate. And that has its own pathway where it goes through the urinary bladder, past the sphincters, through the ureter, out the body. And now the urine has left with all the unnecessary things or excess things that are found within our body itself. Other than that, I think we covered all these structures, so that's the end of the video. Thanks for listening.